It's about practical systems and clear principles that address real-world needs.
The big takeaway here is that you can build this kind of thing anywhere. It all starts with real work, focusing on problems that people genuinely want to solve. Then you just take small steps and learn as you go. A huge key is to find those passionate, informal leaders. The source calls them zoysia plugs, which is a great image. People whose enthusiasm can spread just like a hardy grass. If you support them and create a space for people to connect, you can build incredible momentum. And of course, acknowledge every contribution. It's those simple, consistent actions that build truly powerful communities.
Okay, so if a strong community is the foundation, what are the tools for learning within it? Well, this next section explores that exact question. How can leaders practice making really high-stakes decisions without having to suffer the real high-stakes consequences?
You see, the fundamental problem, as Peter Senge points out, isn't usually a lack of information. It's that our own mental models, the way we think the world works, are often flawed. We see a symptom, we react to it, and in doing so, we can accidentally make the underlying problem even worse. We need a way to see the whole system at play. And this is the solution, the Management Flight Simulator, or as it's called, a micro-world. It's literally a flight simulator, but for managers. It's a safe space, a practice field, where teams can test out their wildest strategies, see the long-term consequences play out in minutes instead of years, and learn from their mistakes without anyone getting hurt or the company losing money. And these simulators have this really powerful dual purpose. On one level, sure, they're for training, just like a pilot learns to fly the plane they're given. But the deeper purpose is all about design. It's not just about learning to operate the system as it is. It's about figuring out how to improve the system itself. It's about building a fundamentally better theory of how your business really works. But to make these things work, it's not actually about the computer. In fact, the real learning happens in the conversations and the debates around the simulation. The whole goal is to get teams to stop just fighting fires and start seeing the underlying structures that cause those fires in the first place.
All right, now for the really fun part. Let's see what happens when these ideas of community and simulated learning come crashing together. This final story from DuPont shows what's possible when you move from a computer screen to a simple game board. So let's set the scene. DuPont had this serious growing problem with maintenance costs. So they did all the research, they built these sophisticated computer models, and they proved with data that proactive maintenance, fixing things before they break, was the answer. But a year later, nothing had changed. The data was crystal clear, but the people on the ground just found it all too abstract. And this is the million-dollar question, isn't it? When you've got the right answer, you've got the proof, but you just can't get anyone to act on it. Why was there such a huge gap between knowing something intellectually and actually changing your behavior in the real world? And this is where everything changed. They had this incredible breakthrough. They realized the problem wasn't the data, it was the delivery. So they threw out all the complex computer models and they created something completely and utterly unexpected, a simple board game. Forget spreadsheets and charts. This was tactile. You're talking about a huge game board, poker chips for equipment and parts, and small teams playing different roles. They had to physically make the trade-offs. Do we fix this urgent breakdown, or do we invest in preventing the next one? The key, as one of the developers said, was that it engaged the emotional element of making decisions. And the results? They were absolutely staggering. Teams that played this game went back to their plants and cut critical equipment failures by 50%. And get this, they did it in just 3 months. This wasn't a small improvement. This was a complete transformation. So why was a simple game so much more powerful than a complex computer model? Well, it's because it took the players on an emotional and an intellectual journey. They didn't just see data, they experienced the system. They started out confused, then maybe a bit resistant, then they got competitive and tried to win. But the game was designed to force a shift in perspective. To succeed, they had to stop fighting each other and start managing the whole system together. That journey from being a warrior to being a caretaker is what turned abstract knowledge into a deep, shared understanding.
Okay, so having seen these powerful examples, how do we translate all of this from theory into action in our own work and our own lives? Here are 3 key things to take away. First, to build community, don't aim for something abstract. Just start a conversation about a real problem that people actually care about. Second, practice thinking in systems.
Before you make a big move, predict the outcome. Then, after, go back and compare what really happened to what you expected. And finally, and this might be the most important one, remember DuPont. If you really want to change minds, don't just show people a spreadsheet. Create an experience.
At the end of the day, this is all about designing better environments for us to think and collaborate. The most resilient organizations are built on strong communities, they provide safe practice fields for learning, and they understand the profound power of play to unlock completely new ways of seeing the world. And that leaves us with a final question to think about. What is one system, in your work or in your life, where progress isn't about getting more information, but about creating a shared experience that could change everything?
Welcome to the Sleep Dives channel. Today, we're jumping into pages 281 to 315, and we're going to tackle a question that, let's be honest, affects every single one of us. Why do we so often get each other so wrong? We're going to explore those invisible mental shortcuts that can lead to so much conflict, and, more importantly, discover a toolkit that can really change how we talk, listen, and connect with each other.
This quote just perfectly captures it, doesn't it? That silent, lightning-fast process we're here to unpack. So picture this. You're in a presentation, right? And your colleague, let's call him Larry, he's just sitting there quietly. Instantly, a story just ignites in your head. You select one piece of data, his silence, and you add your own meaning. He must be bored. Then you make an assumption. He thinks your work is incompetent. And that leads to a conclusion. Larry is against you. And just like that, you're now acting on a belief that you literally built in seconds, all from one tiny observation.
So here's our roadmap for our little journey today. First, we're going to dissect the anatomy of these misunderstandings. Then, we'll bring in a really powerful model called the ladder of inference to help us actually see our own thinking. From there, we'll open up a toolkit for reflection, and we'll focus on that crucial balance between advocating for our own views and inquiring into others. And finally, we'll land on how you can start putting all this into practice, like today. Okay, let's dive into this first section. You know, that story about Larry, that's not just some random example. It's a universal human experience. We all do it. We take in some data from the world, and our minds just race to build a narrative around it, which leads us to a conclusion and then an action, often in the blink of an eye.
And this right here, this gets to the absolute heart of the problem. That whole mental journey from what we see to what we do, it's completely private. It's invisible to everyone else. They just see the starting point, like Larry's silence, and they see our final action, maybe treating him with a bit of suspicion. But that whole story we built in between, that stays hidden. And that gap, that's the real breeding ground for miscommunication.
So, the big question is, how do we make this invisible process, well, visible? That is where our next tool comes in, the ladder of inference. It's just a brilliant way to map out those hidden mental steps, what the source calls our leaps of abstraction, where we jump from a concrete fact to a massive conclusion in an instant.
Okay, let's climb this ladder together, step by step. At the very bottom, we have raw, observable data. You know, what a camera would record. Larry is quiet. Next rung up, we select a piece of that data. We focus only on his silence. On the third rung, we add meaning. Silence means he's bored. From there, we make an assumption. He's bored because he thinks I'm incompetent. Then we draw a conclusion. Larry doesn't respect my work. This hardens into a belief. Larry is an adversary. And finally, at the top, we take action based on that belief. We might avoid him or get defensive in the next meeting. See how fast that happened?
And this is where things get really dangerous. We get stuck in what's called a reflexive loop. Because I now believe Larry is my adversary, the next time we're in a meeting, I'm going to be actively looking for data that confirms that belief. I'll interpret his every action through that filter, which just reinforces my assumptions. And meanwhile, he's probably climbing his own ladder about my strange behavior, and before you know it, we're bitter enemies without ever having a real conversation about it.
And if you want to see the real-world cost of this, check this out. It's staggering. The source gives this incredible example. You can have a team of brilliant people, average IQs of 140, but their collective intelligence can plummet to an IQ of 85. Why? Simply because they're all operating on their own untested assumptions. That's the profound impact of these hidden mental models. So knowing how damaging this can be, what on earth do we do about it?
Okay, so we've diagnosed the problem, we've seen how the ladder works and the damage it can cause. Now let's switch gears and talk about the solution. We're going to open up a practical toolkit that's designed to make our hidden thinking visible, both to ourselves and to others.
This is where we get to flip the script, you know? The ladder isn't just a diagnosis of a problem, it actually becomes a powerful tool for better communication. We can use it in 3 key ways. First, for reflection, just slowing down and asking ourselves, hang on, what data did I just use? What assumptions am I making here? Second, for advocacy, clearly explaining our own reasoning, walking others up our ladder. And third, for inquiry, helping others do the same by asking questions that explore their thinking. I mean, just think about that for a second. What if you could literally see the gap between what you're thinking and what you're actually saying? What could you learn? Well, this brings us to our next powerful tool. This is called the left-hand column exercise. It's incredibly simple, but so revealing. On the right, you write down what was actually said in a tough conversation, and on the left, you write what you were thinking and feeling, but didn't say. Look at this example with Jim and his supervisor Todd. On the surface, what was said is polite, it's accommodating, but his left-hand column, well, it reveals a completely different story, one filled with blame and frustration. This exercise makes that hidden gap tangible. So, once you've created your own left-hand column, the real work begins with reflection. You've got to ask yourself these kinds of questions. What did I really want to achieve here? Why didn't I just say what was on my mind? What assumptions was I making about them? And crucially, what was the cost of operating this way? This analysis, this is where the really deep learning happens.
And this whole toolkit, it really brings us to the core discipline needed for truly productive conversations. It's not about winning an argument, and it's not just about asking questions. It's about skillfully balancing the two. It's about finding the right balance between advocacy and inquiry.
Think of it like this. On one side, you've got high advocacy and low inquiry. That's just a pure argument. You're just pushing your point of view. On the other side, high inquiry and low advocacy. That can feel like an interrogation, right? You're just peppering someone with questions but not sharing your own thoughts. Both of these are pretty dysfunctional. The goal is to land in that sweet spot where you clearly advocate for your view and genuinely inquire into the views of others. That's the space where real learning happens.
So how do you actually do this? Well, here are some simple protocols for better advocacy. Instead of just stating your conclusion, you state your assumptions. You walk people through your reasoning. You give real examples. And I love this one. You reveal where you are least clear. That's not a sign of weakness. It's an invitation for others to help you improve your thinking. It's collaborative. And for inquiry, it's all about creating safety and genuine curiosity. So instead of well, what's your proof for that? You use phrases like, can you help me understand your thinking here? You're not trying to trap them. You're genuinely trying to see the world from their perspective, to understand the ladder that they've climbed.
Okay, so we've covered the theory, the models, and the skills. But this brings us to the most important question of all. How do we actually start doing this? Because let's be real, it can feel a little unnatural at first. Well, the source suggests using what it calls conversational recipes or opening lines. These are phrases you can practice and just have ready to go. Look at this one. It's fantastic. You may be right. That immediately lowers the other person's defenses. But I'd like to understand more. That signals genuine curiosity. What leads you to believe that? This is just a direct, non-confrontational invitation for them to walk you down their ladder of inference. And here is a concrete first step you can take on your own. Pick a situation that's been bothering you. Write out a left-hand column for it, and then use those reflection questions we looked at earlier to analyze what you wrote. And please remember this last point. It's so important. The goal here is radical self-awareness. This is a tool for understanding your own thinking, not for telling other people how they're wrong. The work always starts with you. So, to bring this all together, if there's one single thing to take away from all this, it's this. Those invisible, automatic, and seemingly reasonable leaps that our minds make are the very source of our most painful and persistent misunderstandings. By learning to see them, we give ourselves the power to change them. And that leaves us with a final question for you to reflect on. Think about a relationship or a recurring difficult conversation in your own life. What might happen if you started, even in a small way, to make your own thinking a bit more visible and to genuinely inquire into theirs? What could change for you?
Welcome to the Sleep Dives channel. All right, today we're jumping into pages 281 to 315, and we're going to explore some really powerful tools for, well, untangling our communication. We'll be looking at the mental shortcuts we all take that so often lead to conflict, and we'll unpack the skills we need to build some genuine, real understanding.
So let's kick things off with a question that I think a lot of us have asked. Why is it that you can get a team of really smart, really capable people together in a room and somehow the results are just lackluster? The answer, it turns out, isn't about their intelligence. It's about the invisible, lightning-fast mental processes that are running the show behind the scenes. Okay, here's our game plan. First, we're going to climb something called the invisible ladder to see how we leap to conclusions. Then, we'll get personal with your left-hand column to drag our hidden thoughts into the light. After that, we'll get into the fine art of balancing advocacy and inquiry, look at some super practical tools, and finally, figure out how to turn all this into a skill that actually sticks. Right. Our first tool is a metaphor, and honestly, it's a brilliant one. It's called the ladder of inference, and it perfectly describes a mental journey that you and I take probably dozens of times a day, almost always without even realizing it. Now, the really wild thing about this is the speed. I mean, this isn't some slow, deliberate, logical process. It's a snap judgment. We grab one little piece of raw data from the world, and in a blink, we scramble up a series of mental rungs to land on a belief or an action. It's so automatic that it feels like we're just seeing reality, when actually we're building our own version of it.
Let's make this real with the example here. So the bottom rung, the foundation, is pure observable data. The meeting was set for 9 a.m. and John walked in at 9:30. He didn't say why. Okay, that's a fact. But just watch how fast we climb. Next rung up, we start adding our own meaning. He knew when the meeting started. He chose to come in late. From there, we make a huge leap to a generalization. John is always late. And that's how we get to the very top, a solid, concrete belief. We can't count on John. He's just unreliable. See that? We went from one timestamp to a complete character assassination in just a few seconds.
And here is the absolute kicker. Once we've formed that belief at the top of our ladder, it doesn't just hang out up there. Oh no, it becomes a filter for reality. The very next time we deal with John, we're now unconsciously scanning for evidence that proves he's unreliable. This is the reflexive loop. Our beliefs literally change what data we even notice, which then, of course, reinforces our beliefs. It's a cycle that can be incredibly difficult to escape.
So if this ladder of inference is all happening inside our own heads, how in the world do we become aware of it? Well, that brings us to our next tool. It's a really powerful diagnostic exercise called the left-hand column, and it is designed to expose that massive gap between what we're thinking and what we're actually saying.
Just take a look at this conversation between Jim and his supervisor, Todd. On the right, you've got the actual dialogue. It's polite, it's professional. Jim is saying things like, "I'm happy to talk through any changes." But look over on the left, in his hidden thoughts. It is a completely different universe. He's thinking his constant changes are the real reason we're behind schedule, and it's such a shame I can't just tell him he's the problem. This disconnect right here is the breeding ground for misunderstanding and dysfunction.
Now, the real power of this exercise isn't just writing it down. It's what you do with it afterwards. By looking at your own left-hand column, you can start to ask some really profound questions. Why didn't you say what you were really thinking? What were you assuming would happen if you did? What was the cost of playing it safe? And what was the payoff? Answering these honestly is the first real step to breaking out of those old, unhelpful patterns. Okay, so we've done some internal reflection. We've seen our hidden thoughts. How do we actually use that to have better conversations? Well, the next step is to learn how to test our assumptions out in the open, not just reinforce them in our heads. And that requires a really delicate balance. I absolutely love this visual of the palette of conversation. Think of advocacy, that's stating your view, and inquiry, that's asking about their view, as two primary colors. Now, most of us are pretty good advocates. We know how to make our point. But the real magic, the kind of discussion that creates breakthroughs, happens when you start mixing the colors. When you blend your strong advocacy with genuine, curious inquiry. If you don't, you get stuck in the corners. All advocacy becomes dictating, and all inquiry becomes a pointless interrogation. This phrase right here, this is basically the golden recipe for a balanced conversation. It does two things so perfectly. First, it advocates with transparency. Here is my view, and here is how I have arrived at it. You're literally walking them up your ladder of inference. But then, it immediately pivots to inquiry. How does it sound to you? You're not just asking for agreement, you're genuinely asking them to stress test your thinking, to find the holes, to help you build a stronger idea together. The theory is great, right? But what do you actually say when you're in the middle of a tough conversation? Well, the great news is the source gives us some wonderfully practical protocols. Think of them as recipes that we can start using right away. So when you're advocating for your position, the name of the game is transparency. Don't just drop your conclusion on the table. Show your work, explain the data and the assumptions behind it. And here's a real power move. Reveal where you feel your own thinking is weakest. Saying something like, here's one part of this you might help me think through, isn't a weakness. It's an invitation to collaborate, and it makes people trust you more, not less. And when it's time to inquire about their view, the goal is genuine understanding, not a cross-examination. So instead of a confrontational, well, where's your proof for that? You could try a much softer, more curious phrase like, can you help me understand your thinking here? You're not trying to win a fight, you're trying to see their ladder of inference, to see the world through their eyes for a moment. Now, it's really tempting to look at all these phrases and think of them as just conversational tricks or clever lines to memorize. But the real goal here isn't to just learn a script. It's to bootstrap ourselves into a completely new way of interacting, a new way of learning with other people. Look, becoming truly skillful at this takes practice and it takes reflection. The source suggests a really clear path. You start by using the recipes. Then, after a tough conversation, you go back and examine it. What worked? Where did you get stuck? As you do this over and over, you'll start to develop your own general strategies. You'll get better and better at genuinely seeing things from their point of view. And eventually, you'll feel comfortable enough to ask for feedback directly, turning every single conversation into an opportunity to learn. So let's wrap this up with the big takeaways. First, start noticing your own automatic leaps up the ladder of inference. Second, use that left-hand column tool like a mirror to see the assumptions you're hiding, even from yourself. Third, in every important conversation, consciously practice balancing your advocacy with genuine inquiry. And finally, don't be afraid to start simple. Using those conversational recipes is the best on-ramp to building this as a real, lasting skill. And that leaves us with one final thought. I want you to think about the single most challenging, frustrating, or stuck conversation in your life right now. You know the one. What do you think would happen if, the next time you had it, you decided to simply make your reasoning visible and then you genuinely invited the other person to explore it with you? Just think, how might that one small shift change everything?
Welcome to the Sleep Dives channel. Today we're jumping into pages 316 to 350. And let me tell you, this section is packed with some really powerful tools for organizational learning. We're going to explore how to uncover those hidden assumptions that kind of mess with our communication, and then we'll look at how we can build a truly shared vision for the future together.
So, let's just start with a question to get you thinking. How much does your audience really change your story? I mean, think about it. That last report you wrote, that presentation you gave, did you tweak the message, even just a little? The thing is, we all do it. A lot of the time, we don't even realize it. And that, right there, is exactly where we're going to start this journey.
All right, so here's the game plan. First up, we're going to tackle the whole challenge of truth and our own biases. Then, we'll move on to seeing problems through lots of different eyes, planning for what the future might hold, getting to the real story behind the numbers, and finally, wrapping it all up by figuring out how to build a shared vision.
Okay, let's get right into it. Our first stop is a really fascinating exercise. It's all about making us aware of how our loyalties, to our boss, our team, our clients, how they secretly shape the way we present information.
So this exercise is called the loyalty analysis, and it's a super simple 4-step process. First, you just pick 2 completely different audiences, okay? Then you write a summary of something just for the truth. Like, imagine it's going into a time capsule to be opened in 100 years. No spin. Next, you rewrite that same summary, but this time for each of your 2 audiences. And then the magic happens in step 4. You compare them all. What did you add? What did you leave out? Where'd you kind of soften the language or maybe make it a bit punchier? It's really revealing.
Now, let's be really clear here. The goal isn't to prove that we're dishonest or catch ourselves in a lie. Not at all. The whole point is that this is a tool for self-awareness. It's designed to shine a light on those unconscious patterns in how we communicate, so we can start being more intentional, more honest, and, at the end of the day, just way more effective.
Okay, so once we get a better handle on our own lens, the next logical step is to learn how to see the world through other people's lenses. It's all about moving away from our own, often kind of narrow point of view, and into a much richer, more collective understanding of what's going on.
And here's a brilliant way to do just that. It's called the perspective wheel. Basically, in this exercise, your team literally role plays as different key stakeholders. So you might have one person become the customer, another person is the CEO, someone else has to be the government regulator.
And the task for each person is to explain the problem from that stakeholder's unique point of view. It's incredibly powerful.
And the power of doing this, it's huge. I mean, by forcing us to literally step into someone else's shoes, it just breaks down our natural tendency to get defensive. It completely shatters the echo chamber of groupthink. And what you're left with is a far more nuanced, a far more complete picture of whatever complex situation you're dealing with. All right, this naturally leads us to planning for the future. Now, a lot of people hear scenario planning and they think it's all about predicting what's going to happen, but it's not. It's actually a powerful way to challenge our own conventional wisdom and get our minds ready for uncertainty.
Yeah, and I absolutely love this quote from Napier Collins. He says a scenario is an imaginative leap into the future. The idea is you imagine several different possible futures, not to guess which one is going to be right, but to make yourself more aware of all the forces that are acting on you right now, in the present. It's about building resilience, right? It's not about having a crystal ball.
So, to build these scenarios, you've got to distinguish between two types of forces. On the one hand, you have predetermined forces. These are things we can be pretty sure about. Demographics are a classic example, right? We know exactly how many 20-year-olds there will be in 19 years. But then, on the other hand, you have the uncertain forces, and these are the vast majority of things. Will customers want our new product? Will investors keep putting money into our market? Who knows? Scenarios are what help us explore all the what-ifs around these big uncertainties. Okay, now let's talk about the language of business itself, accounting. There's this great concept from Fred Kaufman called double loop accounting. And what it does is it completely reframes numbers. It says they aren't some objective truth, but a story that we all create together. And it's a story that often hides the most important assumptions we're making. And this table just lays out the difference perfectly. So a typical single-loop conversation is all about defending a number. You know, someone says the net present value is 15%, and the goal is just to win the argument. But a double-loop conversation, the goal is to learn together. It starts with something like, hey, let me tell you the story of how I got to this number. I had to assume 5% market growth and that our supply chain costs would stay stable. What do you guys think about those assumptions? See the difference? It's huge. It shifts the entire focus from defending a position to actually exploring the thinking behind it.
And all of this work we've been talking about, understanding our own biases, seeing things from other perspectives, questioning our assumptions, it all lays the groundwork for our final discipline, building a shared vision. And let's be clear, this isn't about some leader handing down a vision from on high. It's about creating a real, genuine sense of purpose that brings people together, kind of like what Václav Havel did when he was building a new democracy in Czechoslovakia. You see, a true shared vision, it's not just some motivational poster on the wall. It has to bubble up from conversations that are happening at every single level of the organization. It's not a mandate, it's a co-creation. It connects people to a deeper why. And when that happens, it transforms a group of individuals into a real community.
And just so we're on the same page, shared vision is really a whole package of guiding ideas. It's not just one thing. It includes the vision itself. That picture of the future we're trying to create. It's got the values, how we're going to behave day to day. It's got the purpose, the fundamental reason we even exist, and of course the goals, those specific milestones we're committed to hitting. Every single one of these parts plays a crucial role. So the big question is, how do we start putting all these powerful ideas into practice in our own lives, in our own work? Well, the absolute key is to remember that these aren't just one-off exercises you do at a workshop. They are ongoing disciplines.
And you could start really small. Seriously. Before you send that next important email, just take 60 seconds to mentally run that loyalty analysis. In your next team meeting, be the person who asks, hey, whose perspective are we missing here? When someone throws a number at you, gently ask about the story behind the number. Just remember, the biggest mistake you can make is treating these like special one-time events. They're skills, and they only get sharp with constant daily practice. So, as we start to wrap this up, it's pretty clear we've been on a real journey here, haven't we? We've gone from the deeply personal work of looking in the mirror at our own mental models all the way to the collective act of building a shared future together.
Yeah, we've moved from the mirror of self-reflection to the kaleidoscope of seeing through everyone's eyes. We've learned to map out a bunch of possible futures instead of trying to predict just one. And we've learned to look for the story, not just the number. Every single tool we've talked about is a step away from false certainty and a step toward real, shared understanding.
And that really brings us to the final thought. This isn't just interesting theory, right? It's a call to action. So the question I want to leave you with is this. After everything we've just explored, what is the one assumption about your work,
your team, or maybe even yourself that you're going to choose to examine first?
Welcome to the Sleep Dives channel. In this explainer, we're jumping into pages 36 to 70 of our source material. And this is where we really shift gears, moving from the theory of learning organizations into the practical challenge of actually building one. We're going to tackle the biggest question of all. Where on earth do you even start?
So yeah, this is the big one, isn't it? The question that just keeps coming up. I mean, it's one thing to get your head around all the concepts and theories, but it's a completely different challenge to actually start the journey. So this part of our analysis is all about moving from those abstract ideas to the real, tangible architecture you need to create lasting change.
All right, to really get our heads around this, let's use a metaphor, a really powerful one. I want you to imagine yourself as an architect. You're standing in a wide open field, but in your mind, you have this incredible vision for a new building. Now, you don't just start throwing bricks around, do you? Of course not. You need a blueprint, a plan, and architecture that's going to hold the entire thing together. And it's exactly the same for building a learning organization.
And that blueprint, that architecture, is built on 3 core pillars. Think of it like a triangle. On one side, you have your guiding ideas. On another, you have your theory, methods, and tools. And holding it all up, forming the base, are innovations in infrastructure. Each one is absolutely essential. If you try to build without one of them, the whole structure just comes tumbling down.
All right, so let's dig into pillar number 1, guiding ideas. You can think of this as the philosophical cornerstone of the whole project. This is the why behind everything else you're about to do. It's the foundation. So what exactly are guiding ideas? Well, they're basically the soul of the organization. And listen, we're not talking about some bland mission statement that a few execs cooked up over a weekend retreat. No way. We're talking about deeply held principles, the kind that only come from serious thought, deep study, and constant conversation. They spell out what the organization truly stands for and what its people are genuinely trying to create in the world. And this quote, man, it just hits the nail on the head. Bill O'Brien, the former CEO of Hanover Insurance, put it perfectly. He saw that so many companies are just polluted by bad ideas that reinforce themselves, Ideas like climb the corporate ladder no matter who you step on. The only way to fight that, he says, is to consciously cultivate powerful, positive guiding ideas that are just better. Now, the source gives us 3 really profound examples of these guiding ideas, all coming from a systems thinking perspective. And each one, you'll notice, really pushes back against our usual Western way of thinking. First, the primacy of the whole. This idea that the world is already a web of relationships. We don't create them, we're just part of them. Second, the community nature of the self, which argues that we aren't isolated individuals. Our very identity is shaped by our connections to others. And third, the generative power of language, the mind-bending idea that the words we use don't just describe reality, they actually create it. Okay, so you've got your why, you have your philosophy, but that's just the start. How do you actually bring it to life? Well, that brings us to our second pillar, theory, methods, and tools. These are the practical engines that help people not just learn new skills, but more importantly, develop entirely new ways of thinking. Buckminster Fuller had this absolutely brilliant insight about this. You can't just order someone to think differently. It just doesn't work, does it? But if you give them a new tool, something tangible like a systems diagram or a reflective exercise, the very act of using that tool starts to rewire their brain. The tools are the gateway to new thinking. But, and this is a huge but, the tools are pretty much useless unless they are deeply connected to a solid theory. A tool without a theory might work once, maybe by pure luck, but you'll have no idea why it worked, you can't repeat it, you can't build on it, it doesn't transform anything. But when that same tool is backed by a clear theory, it builds real, repeatable knowledge and creates insights that stick. And that leads us right to the third and final piece of our architecture, innovations in infrastructure. This is all about creating the space, the social architecture, if you will, where learning can actually thrive as a natural part of the daily work, not as some special event. Now, when we say infrastructure, I want you to get the image of buildings and IT servers out of your head. That's not what we mean here. We're talking about the organizational structures, the day-to-day work processes, and how you allocate precious resources like people's time and money. It's about weaving learning into the very fabric of the business.
So what does this actually look like in the real world? Well, let's look at a few examples. At Shell, they transformed their whole planning process. It stopped being about predicting the future and started being about helping managers learn and challenge their assumptions. At AT&T, the chairman knew they needed a different kind of conversation, so he created special forums for learning, totally separate from the usual decision-making meetings. And at the car company Saturn, they literally built a learning laboratory right next to the real assembly line so teams could experiment and solve problems on the fly. Okay, so we've got our three pillars: guiding ideas, theory and tools, and infrastructure. But here's the absolute key. You can't treat them like a checklist. They have to work together as a single integrated system. If you neglect any one of them, the whole effort is pretty much guaranteed to fail.
And this table, it just lays it all out, plain and simple. Look what happens when one piece is missing. If you don't have those guiding ideas, there's no passion, no purpose. People just end up chasing the latest management fad. If you don't have theory and tools, nothing really changes. People talk about openness, but it's all superficial. And if you don't have the right infrastructure, all the good intentions in the world don't matter because there's no time, no space, and no resources. Learning just isn't taken seriously.
You know, the whole quality circle movement back in the day is a perfect, almost tragic example of this in action. Companies introduced a new infrastructure, this new type of meeting, but they failed to provide the workers with the actual statistical tools they needed or to build a deep guiding philosophy around what quality really meant. And because the other two pillars were missing, the whole thing just fizzled out.
So we've built this incredible external architecture, right? With these three strong pillars. But it makes you stop and ask, what's it all for? What is it all supposed to be supporting? Because the true foundation for all of this isn't a policy or program. It's something much, much closer to home.
And this is where we get to the absolute heart of the matter. This quote really says it all. An organization isn't some machine you can tinker with. It's a living, breathing product of how the people inside it think and how they interact. That means the biggest lever for change isn't in rewriting the org chart or shifting budgets. The real leverage is in ourselves.
Okay, so this idea of looking inward is great, but how do you do it? How can you actually tell if real, genuine learning is happening in your team or your company? Well, thankfully, the source gives us a really practical checklist you can use to find out.
Let's go through these 4 questions together because they're an incredibly powerful way to diagnose what's going on. First, do we constantly test our experiences, even when everything is going great? It's easy to reflect after a failure, right? But a real learning culture questions its successes. Second, are we actually producing new knowledge? And by that we mean a real, tangible ability to act more effectively, not just collecting more data. Third, is that knowledge shared? Is it accessible? If a brilliant idea stays locked in one person's head, it's not organizational learning. And finally, number 4, is this learning actually relevant to our core purpose? Does it help us do what we're here to do? And this really brings us to the biggest trap, the most common mistake that organizations fall into time and time again. They get really excited about one piece of the puzzle. They'll buy a flashy new collaboration tool or announce a big restructure, but they do it in a vacuum, completely ignoring the need for a guiding philosophy or the right infrastructure to support it. That is a recipe for failure. Real, lasting progress only ever happens when you are patiently and intentionally developing all 3 pillars together in balance. So, to wrap this all up, what's the big takeaway? It's that building a learning organization means you have to think like an architect. You need a clear blueprint that brings together profound guiding ideas, powerful theories and tools, and a supportive infrastructure. But you have to remember that all of it, every single piece, is ultimately designed to spark a fundamental shift inside each of us. And that leaves us with one final, very personal question. The architecture gives you the how, but it can't give you the what. That part is up to us. So the real question you need to walk away with isn't just about the framework. It's about your own vision. What kind of organization are you helping to build?
You know, one of the hardest parts of leadership is building a vision that doesn't just end up as a poster on a wall, but one that actually lives and breathes inside your team. Well, today we're going to unpack a really powerful 5-stage framework that shows you how to get there, how to move from just telling people what the future is to actually co-creating it with them in a way that inspires true, genuine commitment.
Think about it. We've all seen this, right? A charismatic leader gets up on stage, gives this big, inspiring speech, unveils a brand new vision, and then nothing. Crickets.
Nothing really changes. So why on earth does this happen so often? Well, it's because a real shared vision isn't a one-time event. It's a process. It's a journey. And we're about to map out that entire journey for you.
This quote from the late Bill O'Brien, wow, it just uses such a brilliant analogy. He compared a toxic, power-driven company culture to a paper mill. You know, when you first get there, the smell is just overwhelming. But if you stick around long enough, you actually get used to it. And here's the danger. Just because you stop noticing the smell doesn't mean it isn't harming you. It stunts your growth. And that is exactly what's at stake when a team is missing a real shared purpose.
So, let's say you do it. You start building a shared vision, and people actually get excited about it. That's the goal, right? Well, yes. But it brings this whole new set of challenges that, frankly, most leaders just don't see coming. The very success of the process completely changes the game. This quote absolutely nails the shift in a leader's world. I mean, it's one thing to try and get a stagnant team moving. It's a whole other thing to channel the explosive energy of a newly inspired one. Your job literally transforms. You go from being a controller to being a conductor, from a motivator to a mentor. All of a sudden, you have to learn how to listen and guide all this new initiative without accidentally squashing it. So, how do you manage those wild horses? How do you steer all that energy? This is where this amazing framework comes in. I want you to think of it like a ladder of engagement, a clear, 5-stage path that any organization can climb to build a vision that is truly shared.
And here is the ladder itself. Just notice the 2 different directions here. As you move from left to right, you see the active involvement from everyone in the organization just goes up and up. And as you climb higher on the ladder, the required leadership capacity also grows. And that's not just from the boss, but from everyone. So the most important question you can ask yourself is, where is my organization on this ladder right now? Okay, let's start at the very bottom rung, telling. This is the classic top-down, my way or the highway approach. The boss has the vision, and the team is just expected to execute it. Now look, sometimes this is necessary, like in a crisis when there's no time to debate. But the result is always, always compliance. People will do what you tell them, but their hearts just won't be in it.
All right, one step up from that. We've got selling. So here, the leader isn't just barking orders, they're actually trying to enroll people. They're making a case for the vision, treating employees almost like customers who need to be persuaded to buy in. It's definitely more engaging, but the vision itself still comes from one place, the top. Now, things start to get really interesting. At the testing stage, the leader puts a vision out there and genuinely asks for feedback. It's kind of like market research. And the key word here is test. It implies that the feedback isn't just for show. It's actually going to be used to refine and improve the final vision. Okay, moving up to the next stage, the whole dynamic really starts to flip on its head. This is consulting. The leader isn't walking into the room with a finished idea anymore. Instead, they're starting with a question. What do you all think we should do? Now, the leader still makes the final call, but the vision itself is now being shaped by the collective wisdom of the entire group. And finally, we get to the very top of the ladder, co-creating. This is where the real magic happens. It's a true partnership. And here's why this is so incredibly powerful. It creates psychological ownership. When people are part of building the vision from the ground up, it stops being the boss's vision and it becomes our vision. And the motivation totally shifts. It goes from extrinsic, doing something for a paycheck or to please a manager, to intrinsic. People are working to build what they truly want to build. So, you might be thinking, okay, this all sounds great in theory, but does it actually work in the real world? And the answer is a resounding yes. Let's just take a look at the incredible transformation of Hanover Insurance under the leadership of Bill O'Brien, whose quote we saw a minute ago. It is the perfect case study for these principles in action. Before their big transformation back in the 1970s, Hanover was a classic authoritarian company. That smell O'Brien talked about, it was the smell of power games, of politics, and of fear. The only goal was to please your boss and climb the corporate ladder. Afterwards, they became a company driven by shared values, what they called their governing ideas. Decisions were suddenly based on merit, not on who you knew. Information was open, and authority was pushed down to the local level where it belonged. And the result of all this? Well, look, this wasn't just some feel-good cultural victory. It was a stunning financial one. By focusing on building this vision-driven organization, their stock price just skyrocketed from 90 cents to $40 over 2 decades. It's powerful proof that purpose and profit are not enemies. They are, in fact, essential partners. Okay, so you're probably feeling pretty inspired by this. You want to start climbing that ladder in your own organization. So how do you actually begin? Let's distill all of this down into some clear, practical advice for any leader who wants to put this into practice.
There are 4 key steps. First, find a partner. You cannot be the star actor and the stage manager at the same time. Second, assess yourself and be honest about it. Are you naturally a teller or a co-creator? Third, you have to make it personal. People connect to real stories and genuine passion, not abstract corporate goals. And finally, and this is the big one, be accountable. Nothing kills a vision faster than a leader who doesn't live by the very values they preach.
But, and this is a really big but, here's a crucial piece of wisdom, borrowed from the community organizer Saul Alinsky. This is a gradual process. If your organization is stuck way down in telling mode, trying to jump straight to co-creating is probably going to fail, and it'll create a massive backlash. The goal is to move just one step, 1 degree at a time. You build the capacity, you build the trust, and then you take the next step.
So, we're going to leave you with a challenge. Take a hard, honest look at this ladder. Where is your team right now? And even more importantly, what is the one next step you could take to start climbing? It doesn't have to be a giant leap. It just has to be the very first move on your journey from telling to co-creating.
Welcome to the Sleep Dives channel. Today, we're diving into pages 386 to 419 of our source, and we're tackling a couple of really massive challenges. You know, the kind that can make or break any team. How do you build a vision that everyone actually gets behind? And, maybe even more important, how you take all that raw, messy energy of conflict and actually turn it into something creative. Well, let's find out. So let's start right here with a scene of just total animosity. And look, this quote isn't just some dramatic language. It's describing the actual feeling in a room at a steel company that was stuck in decades of conflict. It's the kind of rock-bottom place that just seems impossible to come back from. So first, we're going to unpack how things get this bad, and then we'll look at the incredible tools they use to turn that hate into something truly amazing. So, where does this kind of mess usually begin? Well, as we're about to see, a super common but critical failure point is the leader themselves. It's about how even the ones with the best intentions can accidentally slam the brakes on progress and just shatter trust. Okay, this is such a brilliant way to think about it. Normally, in a hierarchy, all the power flows down, right? But when you genuinely ask people to create something together, you reverse that current. All of a sudden, you've got this massive surge of ideas, of feedback, of pure energy flowing up from the team. And if the leader isn't ready to handle that kind of voltage, well, they can, as it says here, blow a fuse. And what happens when that fuse blows? Well, this slide lays out the fallout perfectly. It's not just some small hiccup, it's a fundamental breach of trust. That unspoken promise of openness, it's broken. The team learns a really dangerous lesson. Your ideas are welcome, but only until they make things uncomfortable. And according to our source, the only way to even begin to fix that is for the leader to be brutally honest about what really forced them to pull the plug. So, how do you stop this from happening in the first place? Well, the solution doesn't start with trying to fix the leader. It starts by making the whole system stronger. And step 1 is building a vision that is genuinely shared by everyone. All right, let's look at a really practical tool for this. This isn't about writing some fluffy mission statement nobody reads. It's a really simple 2-step process. First, the team gets together and paints this super vivid, detailed picture of their ideal future. Then, you come crashing right back down to earth with an honest look at where you are today. And the magic happens in that gap between those 2 points. It creates this powerful creative tension that makes the whole journey feel both urgent and totally possible. You know, a vision without a plan is just a nice daydream. So to make it real, the team has to define these strategic priorities. Just think of them as the big, concrete chunks of work that have real, measurable results. They're like the stepping stones that get you from your current reality to that future you just imagined. And here's a perfect example of what that looks like. See how it's not vague at all? 80% of our managers will be trained in facilitating dialogue by mid-1995. It's specific, it's measurable, it has a deadline, it's a concrete action that you can see directly builds towards that bigger vision of a more collaborative company. But, you know, even if you have a great shared vision and these super clear priorities, there's still a piece of the puzzle missing. The team needs a discipline for learning together. And as our source makes really clear, that discipline, it lives or dies by the quality of the team's conversations. Okay, this part is so important. The word discussion, it actually shares a root with words like percussion and concussion. It literally means to smash things to pieces. It's a battle, an advocacy war where the whole point is to win. But dialogue, well, that comes from roots that mean meaning flowing